Commentary of Hegel's Logic, Part 11, Shine, by Ilmari Jauhiainen. Second book, Essence. The previous book had two different sides, the general ontology and the ontology of mathematical structures. The book began from a very general method of producing examples of the most general ontological structures. It showed how it is possible to relate any situation or state of being to other situations, and then how to combine these different situations into aspects of one larger or more informative situation. After this general ontology, Hegel proceeded to construct one particular structure type, namely that of quantities or number systems. This was a potentially infinite structure with a possibility to find indefinitely many quantitative situations, and with a possibility to change the reference point of the system in such a manner that only the relations of the situations remained. We saw that it was possible to construct several such number systems with different qualities or having different dimensions. The next issue was the functions from one such system to another. Hegel constructed a variety of such functions and a whole algebra for them. Indeed, we found out that there were a number of possible function algebras depending on how the order of combinations was determined. The purpose of this interesting construction was merely to get an example of a series of qualitatively different objects or situations, ordered according to some quantitative factors. Then we saw how stages of such a series could be interpreted as aspects of one substrate. The aspects were, in this interpretation, mere quantitatively different states of the substrate. The relation of a substrate to its aspects was then an example of an indifferent structure. It was arbitrary to the substrate how it was divided, and it was external to the aspects that they happened to be combined. Yet, if a substrate was given, we could construct some differences from it, and if different aspects were given, we could change one aspect into another, because they were part of one quantitative series, and thus turn the framework of many parts into an undifferentiated unity. Hence, we had constructed an example of a natural classification, to a state of identity and a state of difference, and an essence or method of constructing this classification. The subject matter of this book is the structure of essence, a rule or method by which all aspects of a naturally interconnected structure can be constructed. The construction can mean literal creation of the object or situation corresponding to a structure, somewhat like an essence of a cake is a recipe telling how to manufacture the cake from given ingredients, and also a mere discovery of the aspects of the object or situation. For example, through the physical laws, we can predict the position of the moon in an arbitrary moment, when its position in another moment is given. Note that in these examples one needs something else beyond the essence in order to fully determine the required structure. You can't bake the cake without flour and sugar. One task of this book is to construct an example of an essence that is by itself sufficient for construction of some structure. This sort of essence would be what Hegel calls a concept. Clearly, the difference between the second and third book of the logic is not as great as the difference between the first and the second book, although Hegel's division of logic into objective and subjective logic would suggest otherwise. The division of the book on essence varied very much. The divisions in Wissenschaft der Logik and in Enzyklopädie are quite different, as some of the material from the division on appearance has been combined with the division on essence in itself. Still, the classification of the book is quite natural, although the first division is, once again, somewhat more important than the latter two. We first look at an essence within one structure, then produce a framework of structures from it, and finally find a more comprehensive essence for this new framework. Paragraph 678. The structure of essence is more informative in comparison with a mere state of being. This is one of the first times, if not the first time, in logic where Hegel uses the peculiar phrase, A is the truth of B. It seems clear that the phrase has nothing to do with what we usually understand by truth, that is, the truth of a statement, belief, theorem, or similar. Hegel is speaking of structures, like state of being and essence, and it is hard to conceive how structure could be true in the same sense as, for example, beliefs. The phrase appears to have two aspects. Firstly, it states that structure A can be constructed from the structure B. For instance, when any state of being or group of states of being is given to us, we can construct an example of essence. That is, although we would be aware only of externally combined structures and classifications, we could still find out an example of a naturally interconnected structure. Note that the phrase does not necessarily say that a particular structure of type B could also be seen as a structure of type A. For example, although we have a method of finding essences from states of being, we do not necessarily have a justified method for interpreting all apparently external collections of states of being as truly essential. There can be truly external or arbitrary classifications, like the division of Eurasia into Europe and Asia. Secondly, the phrase points out that if a structure can be justifiably interpreted as both A and B, the statement that it is A is less informative than the statement that it is B. Thus, it is far more informative to know an essence of a structure than merely all the aspects of the structure, because we may find out all these aspects from the essence. And furthermore, by knowing the essence, we know that the structure itself is essentially interconnected. For example, it is far more important to know the law governing the movement of the planets than merely the collection of the positions they have been located at in the past month. Paragraph 679. What is given is always some situation or state of being, and if we want to know the rule governing this state of being, we must go behind the situation in order to find something else as its essence. Essence is not given to cognition as essence, but it must be constructed as the essence of some given situation. Essence is later in the series of structures, although the series need not be temporal. The paragraph suffers from the problematic of trying to speak of atemporal relations through temporal analogies, somewhat like earlier Hegel tried to describe the ability to move from any state of being to a state of nothing as becoming, although an ability does not yet imply any temporal relation between situations. Similarly, it is not like there would first be a state of being, and only after that, its essence. It is better to say that the temporality is involved only when cognition of the structures is spoken of. We may cognize essence only after we have cognized some state of being. Still, even this is not the whole truth, because this temporal relation between cognitions depends on a relation of primariness between a state of being and its essence. A state of being or a situation, or generally a structure, can exist without any essence. Witness, for instance, any arbitrary collection without any essence. Essence, on the other hand, is always an essence of some possible structure, and thus always mediated by it. An essence is no true essence if one cannot construct a structure by means of it. Paragraph 680. At first sight, the movement from a state of being to its essence seems external to the state of being. The transition from a mere structure that seems to be a mere external construct into seeing the same structure as having an essence seems in one sense to be no true change, but only a change in interpretation. For instance, if a person discovers a law governing the movement of planets, it is not the planets that have changed because of the discovery, but the person and his state of knowledge. The person can now use their state of knowledge to determine the positions of the planets. Generally, scientific discoveries do not by themselves change the conditions of the phenomena discovered, but only the condition of the scientists and people who learn of their inventions. Paragraph 681. Still, the move to essence is natural to a state of being. Although the transition to an essence of a structure does not concern the structure, this transition is not artificial, like an arbitrary classification would be. Indeed, if we are justified in assuming that a structure has an essence, then the aspects of this structure must be naturally interconnected. One might still object that perhaps there aren't any natural structures, but only external combinations of independent parts. At the end of the previous book, Hegel tried to show a construction by which one could always find an example of an essentially interconnected structure. And although this construction was based on raising the level of abstraction from different states of an arbitrary classification to the division of the classification itself and a common substrate behind it, it still provided us with one example of essence. 682. The most complex and informative structure is not any more a mere state of being, but an essence. We cannot be satisfied with states of being here, nor even with abstract state of being, which always presupposes an abstractive movement away from states of being here, and is thus, in some sense, an essence. Here, the move to a unity is not natural, but external to the concrete states of being. If essence is defined as such an abstraction, it is a mere artificial product, and the differences remain in a context outside the essence and equally valid. Essence is here merely in viewpoint of an abstractive construction and in relation to another state of being. Hegel introduces here the idea that certain categories of logic could be understood as predicates of something called absolute. The concept of absolute is properly introduced later, but we could here surmise that absolute is some sort of structure or object appearing in many different situations or contexts. That is, the common subject matter in some field of discussion. Furthermore, as the name absolute seems to imply, it is not just any subject matter, but one that is felt to be important, for example, because of its complexity. Thus, when Hegel says that absolute is no longer mere being, but an essence, he is merely insisting that we shouldn't anymore be satisfied with mere description of situations and structures, but that we should at least try to find if these structures have some essence from which to understand it. Hegel also separates the essence as he means from a pure state of being, which some person might identify with essence. The common factor in the pure state of being and essence is that a conscious person must find both through some construction, because in immediate life we are acquainted with mere states of being in some framework of possible states of being. The difference is that pure state of being, or indeed any more general state of being, is constructed through an abstraction from any structure or classification, natural or unnatural. Thus, I could abstract the common factor of living in this neighborhood from the group consisting of me and all my neighbors, while essence of a structure is then in a necessary connection with the aspects of the structure. If there is a law governing the movement of the planets, then they must obey them in every position. An abstraction is independent of the abstracted elements, and vice versa. I could move away from this neighborhood, and thus fail to satisfy the concept of living in this particular neighborhood, while the neighborhood could be filled with completely other persons. Furthermore, while one can use essence to determine the aspects of a structure, we can determine the positions of the planets if we know the law behind their movements. One cannot determine on a basis of a mere abstraction the more detailed content of the elements from which the abstraction is made. The concept of living in this neighborhood cannot be used to determine that I live at a particular house in this neighborhood. Hegel refers once again to the definition of God, or pure essence, as a sum of all realities. The idea was that only some properties were thought to be real properties, while other apparent properties, the negations of realities, were mere lack of reality. Hegel has already noted that such classification was without any foundation. All possible properties or types of situations were real in the sense that they could be actual. Darkness is as real a property of situations as light. If God, or indeed any essence, was restricted to being an essence of one sort of properties, it would be a mere abstraction in comparison to the larger framework of characteristics. One couldn't construct from an essence of a supposed reality an instance of a negation of that reality, for instance. One couldn't construct darkness from abstract light. As the supposed realities of God were usually the hazier and more indeterminate characteristics, for example, unity in comparison with multiplicity, one could say that such a God had no real properties. 683. Our example of essence has not been constructed artificially, but through natural constructions from one aspect of a state of being or structure to another. It is the common element of these aspects because it can assume any of them as its guise, but it is no abstraction because it can be used to construct the aspects. While an essence understood as abstraction is a mere artificial construct, an essence in the Hegelian sense is a natural construct. The planets wouldn't be what they are now if their movements were governed by different laws, and cakes wouldn't be cakes if they weren't baked according to a recipe. Hegel clarifies the difference between an abstraction and a true essence with the familiar concepts an and für sich sein, although the latter is used with a new twist. The state or aspect of being in itself is the familiar state of being abstracted from a more concrete state of being here. Both an abstraction and an essence are in itself for some structure, in the sense that no matter what aspect of the respective structure we are given, we can always abstract the abstract or proper essence from it. Both abstract and proper essences could be called substrates in the sense of the previous book. The difference is that an essence is also a state of being for itself. As we should remember, the state of being for or according to itself was originally explained as a sum of different parts and aspects of a structure in the sense that in it apparently separate parts were revealed to be mere aspects of the same object. Here, essence is not so much a sum of the aspects, but a method by which such a sum could be constructed, or even the very process of construction. It is the rule by which we can determine what parts and aspects a structure has, or by which we can even find an actual use of such a rule. 684. After the integration of all different states of being, the structure of essence is simple, and contains differences only as potential states that have not been constructed. But it must be possible to construct or actualize these differences, because essence is a capacity to do so. This construction of different situations differs from constructions in the previous phase. Here, these new states are instantly known as mere modifications of the original essence, although they are in some sense also independent. We must proceed to construct these differences. Like in all the sections following some construction of an important structure, we begin with the most abstract example of such a structure. Thus, the Book of Essence begins with a mere or absolute essence. That is, we have merely some instance of a rule or method for construction of some structure or framework of situations, but no actual structure has yet been constructed. Of course, here the construction of such a structure or framework is quite easy. If we already have an infallible method of creating or discovering something, what could be simpler but to use this method for creating or discovering? Hegel points out that the construction of a new structure is therefore different than in the previous stage. Earlier, the constructed structures appeared truly alien to the structures from which they were constructed, while here it is more natural to view the different structures or situations as essentially connected, and thus as aspects of a larger structure. 685. The essence is in some sense similar to a state of quantity. To both, the position in a classification is arbitrary. The difference is that in a state of quantity, the position is merely given. We can always relate a quantity to other quantities, but there is nothing in the quantity to inform us to which quantity it will be related, while the essence contains information, what aspects we can construct from it. These aspects are in some sense mere modifications of the essence. The paragraph appears to use the method in favor of some Hegel scholars, who try to find some deep connections between the different stages of Hegel's philosophy, and especially in the classifications Hegel gives of different subject matters. For example, the division of the philosophy of nature to mechanical, physical, and organic phases should correspond with the division of the objectivity in the third book of Logic to mechanism, chemism, and teleology. As Hegel himself mentions explicitly only few such parallelisms, the stage is free for different scholars to invent the parallelisms they need. Often it is confusing what these supposed parallelisms are meant to say and whether they should explain something. Here, Hegel himself mentions that the essence has a similar position in the whole, presumably the whole of logic, as quantity has in the book on being. But nothing much is revealed if one just looks at an analogy between the series of quality, quantity, and measure, and the series of being, essence, and concept. Especially, as I have suggested, at least one of these classifications is somewhat arbitrary. And furthermore, other classifications also do not consist of parts of equal rank. The true meaning behind Hegel's analogy is revealed by his explanation of the similarity of quantities and essences. To both quantity and essence, it is arbitrary in what manner they are determined. Actually, instead of quantity, we might as well speak also of substrate or concrete state of indifference. The whole series of structures from the pure quantity to the absolute indifference is characterized by what could be called a quantitative form. Further reason not to pay much attention to the idea that the position of the different sections would be the important point in the so-called parallelism. The difference that Hegel sees in the roles of quantities and essences is thus explained more fully when we speak instead of the difference of quantities and substrates from essences. When we try to determine in what possible situations a certain quantity or substrate could exist, we cannot achieve this determination merely on the basis of the quantity or the substrate itself, but we have to assume some given differentiation of possible states or aspects of the quantity or substrate. Essence, on the other hand, contains in itself the recipe of producing this differentiation. Thus, the possible aspects of the essence are more reliant on the essence, or they are its reflections, a Hegelian term which often confuses scholars and leads them to fantastic voyages, and which we shall investigate later. 686. The complexity of a structure of essence is in midpoint between the complexities of abstract states of being and concepts, and we can construct essences from states of being and concepts from essences. A mere essence is only an abstract method of construction, and thus is only an alternative to a situation with no essence. We have to show how to construct frameworks of situations from an essence. In other words, we have to construct concepts, or an infallible method of construction requiring no external matter, from mere essences, or methods requiring some external matter for construction. Certain products of concepts are other methods of construction or concepts, while all products of essences are mere constructed states of being. The essence is characterized by the aspect of being in itself, or it is merely the first negation of states of being. Both statements indicate that essence is still an abstract structure compared to another structure. While the essence is a method or rule for constructing certain situations and objects, one still needs some starting point for these constructions, that is, some given state of being which to manipulate in order to produce the required results. One needs a planet in order to calculate its next position, and one needs flour, eggs, and sugar in order to manufacture a cake. As the material required by the essence is something different from that essence, the result of the construction differs similarly from the essence. It is a situation or an object of the same kind as the material of the construction, a planet in a new position, or a cake. In the stage of concept, on the other hand, the material required by the method is in some sense the method itself. The method of construction can modify itself, or it is just a stage of a self-modifying process, and the results produced with such a method are further methods. Somewhat similarly, like a living being has a capacity to produce objects with all the capacities the living being itself has. That is, another living being. 687. 1. At first, we look at how an essence shows itself in itself, that is, what aspects we can construct from it when we abstract from all external relations. 2. Then we look at how the essence appears in a larger framework, that is, we construct a classification of situations and objects from it. 3. Finally, we investigate how the essence reveals itself, or we interpret the essence and its appearance as modifications of one actuality. The division of the book on essence is characterized by different ways to describe showing oneself, Yet, there is no need to feel mystified, as Hegel also offers a more detailed explanation of the stages in the study of essence. Firstly, we take an essence as it is in itself. That is, we look merely at its relation to the structure which it is essence of, but abstract from the relations that the essence and its structure have to other structures or objects. Secondly, we construct an example of a state of being here from the essence. That is, we construct a classification of structures or objects and compare the structure of the essence with other structures. Finally, we find a new essence that is one with the appearance. That is, we look at the larger framework of objects and structures and try to find some rule or method by which it could be constructed.